Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I'm Xiaodan, a faculty member of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you for joining us today. This is the inaugural event of an online speaker series titled Yellow Peril Redux, from coolies to concentration camps, trade wars, and coronavirus, presented by the Yellow Peril Redux Project and funded by the Call to Action to Address Racism and Social Justice research program of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Let me first briefly introduce to you what the program and the project are, and I will pass it on to the chair of today's event, Professor Craig Kozlowski, who is joining us from Europe, somewhere in Europe. And he will introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Michael Keevak, who is joining us from Taiwan. So the project, the rhetoric of Yellow Peril dates to the so-called Asian invasions of the 19th century. The COVID-19 pandemic inspired a resurgence of this rhetoric and its consequences. The American perception of Yellow Peril and the racial bias and strategies of othering it has mobilized intersect with intercultural misunderstandings and international interactions, the making and lifting of legal boundaries, economic development and competitiveness, technological and scientific collaborations and contestations, as well as tensions between globalization and nationalism. Our project situates Yellow Peril in the history as a history, in the US history as a history of systemic racism, complicated by the US East Asian relations and by the mutual misunderstandings and understandings between different cultures. We study its historical moments and developments, cultural expressions, and social consequences, historically and in the present. And this project, collaborative project, draws on our research and teaching expertise on UIUC campus and extends our relationships with community partners off campus, inside and outside of Illinois. This project is funded by the Call to Action to Address Racism and Social Injustice research program. That program started in July 2020 when Chancellor Jones announced a $2 million annual commitment by the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, to focus the intellectual and scholarly talent of our university to examine two of the greatest challenges facing our society and seek new solutions. So this program provides support for academic research and the expansion of community-based knowledge that advances the understanding of systemic racism and generationally embedded racial disparity. So our team, let me, here. This is a summary of our project. By the way, this is a blog site. If you want to get emails, news from us, you can register there. Yang, our GA, can paste this link to the chat room, okay? Then this is a brief of our Call to Action program. Then this is our team. From this slide, you will see our team includes professors, scholars and community members from different fields and disciplines, as well as undergrads and graduate students of different majors. And here, please allow me to express our special thanks to Professor Andrew Morris of Texas A&M, who provided invaluable suggestions that helped us to build this project. And thanks to our wonderful GA, Ms. Yang Liu, for all her coordination work, and to our outreach partner, Ms. Michelle Zhang of Yuan She, the Society of Delighted Heart, and NGO of Asian Americans in California, for her promotional work among Asian American communities. So one more thing, before I pass it on to Professor Kozlowski, let me make a quick announcement of two upcoming events. We will have more to come. On April 28th, Justice Sabrina Shizue McKenna of the Supreme Court of Hawaii will talk about the Yellow Peril and the law. On May 12th, Director Miles Matsuno will talk about his documentary making of a Japanese American family's experiences during the Second World War after Prague. So welcome to register for the upcoming talks. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Today, our chair is Professor Kozlowski. He is Professor of History and Germanic Languages and Literatures, UIUC. He works in early modern European global history. Currently, he's researching on how societies in the early modern world understood skin and how their views evolved. Craig, the podium is yours now.
Thank you so much, Dan. Hello, Michael. It's a pleasure to meet you, even if only via Zoom. Thank you for inviting me to play a very small role in this inaugural Yellow Peril lecture and discussion. Everything coming through clear and audible in other parts of the world? Yes? Yes? Great. Well, then it's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Michael Keevak. I've known about his work for well over a decade now, and I have indeed assigned his work to my students, specifically his work, Becoming Yellow, A Short History of Racial Thinking, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2011. And it is a forthright, concise, and powerful study of racial thinking focused on Western conceptions of East Asian identity from the early modern period, which is my focus, into the 20th century. It's a book that I highly recommend if you haven't encountered it already. Michael Keevak is a professor in the Department of Foreign Languages at National Taiwan University in Taipei. He's been there since 1993 and was promoted to full professor in 2001. He's an extraordinarily productive and wide-ranging scholar, with his most recent publication just published last year by Hong Kong University Press. The book is called On Saving Face, A Brief History of Western Appropriation and crudification of this concept of face, as I understand it. On Saving Face from Hong Kong University Press, distributed in North America by the University of Chicago Press, so a book that is not difficult to locate. Prior to that, and not that long ago in 2017, Professor Keevak published Embassies to China, Diplomacy and Cultural Encounters Before the Opium Wars. As I mentioned, Becoming Yellow, A Short History of Racial Thinking, appeared in 2011. Before that, a study of a delightful imposter, the pretended Asian George Salmanazar's 18th century Formosan hoax, was published in 2004. His first book-length publication was on Shakespeare, a publication from 2001. Professor Keevak has been a visiting fellow at universities in Utrecht and Amsterdam, in Berlin and Hamburg, and at Princeton University. And I hope he will also provide a few words on his current project on the history of the ugly word Chinaman in modern parlance. If I understand correctly, that is his current ongoing project. So with that quick attempt to summarize a lot of exciting scholarship from a very productive and engaging scholar, let me hand the floor over now to Professor Keevak for his discussion of Becoming Yellow, how East Asians became yellow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig. I hope everyone can hear me and hear me clearly. I'm going to share my screen now because I have some images that I want to use to look at. Just a moment. And I want to begin by saying how honored I am to be a speaker in this important series to fight racism or institutionalized racism in our contemporary societies, and how important that work is. And I'm also honored to be the inaugural speaker, and I think it's appropriate that I am, because I'm going to talk today about origins. Rather than speaking about racism in the 21st century, I'm more interested in our talk today to give you some idea of where this idea specifically of yellowness, originates. As we mentioned in the introduction to this talk, the idea of a peril from Asia is a very old one in the European imagination. It dates back at least to the invasions of the Mongols in the 14th century, when there was a very real threat that the Mongols would overrun Europe. In fact, in the 14th century, they came to the edge of what at the time was called Christendom. They came to the border between Hungary and Austria. So they really were ready to overrun Europe at the time, and your leaders of Europe were terrified of this invasion. So there is this notion of a peril, the idea of hordes of people from Asia overrunning or overpowering European governments and peoples. This was a very real fear during this period, and it remained in the European imagination as a dangerous Asia or a dangerous East. However, there's absolutely no tradition for the idea of a yellow peril. The idea of yellowness, whatever that means, that horrible, evil word, whatever that means, it comes much later. It's in fact only traceable back to the 18th century. And in fact, you could say even to the 19th century. The idea of the peril as the yellow one is very recent and comes from a totally different direction. And so we need to understand what is the source of this idea of yellowness, and of course, how we might be able to combat it and to dismantle it in all of its nefarious manifestations. So on the screen, I have a picture of my book because this talk will, in the main, be a summary of what's in the book. And so I encourage anyone who's interested to have a look at it for further detail. We're going to begin by showing the way that Europeans actually came to Asia in the early modern period. In the medieval period, I hope you can see my mouse moving. In the medieval period, the Europeans who came to Asia came via the Silk Road. The most famous traveler was Marco Polo in the 13th century, and various other people. They came over a land route. The other possible route was to come through the Middle East and to India, actually a much easier and faster and simpler route, and then from India to sail into the South China Sea. But by 1400 or 1500, those two routes were closed to Europeans. There was no way for Europe to reach Asia except by sea. And so it was the Portuguese who were the first to master the technology to sail around the tip of South Africa into the Indian Ocean, to the Indian Peninsula, past what is now Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, into the South China Sea, reaching southern China, Taiwan, and Japan. So the point is that they made a very long and circuitous route to reach the peoples of Asia. And what they saw on the way were peoples that they identified as darker than themselves, almost universally. They were first encountering Africans and then Indians and then Malay people and so on. And finally coming into the area of southern China and Japan, what they saw, I think, surprised them. The people that they met in the first place were incredibly, according to their judgment, incredibly civilized, wealthy, literate, cultured, with sophisticated systems of government and religion and so on. And I think that was something of a surprise to them. And compared to, I realize my connection is a little on my back, I hope. I realized that this level of surprise and almost satisfaction when they finally reached this furthest point of Asia, that these people were superior compared to the others that they would have met on the way. And so when they began to meet these people and they described their appearance, they routinely described them as white people. And on the screen, I've given you three very early quotations of people who entered China and Japan, or the Chinese and Japanese region, and specifically call them white people. Now we have to understand that the word white here does not only mean coloring. White is an evaluative term as well as a descriptive term. To call someone white was a compliment towards them. It was a way of appreciating them or evaluating them as a superior people. And so there's a certain, I think, surprise when these people were finally encountered that they were initially called white people. However, soon enough, this initial whiteness, if I can put it that way, began to change. And when people had more experience in the region, they began to slightly alter their vision or alter their description of these people. And whenever their coloring was described, there begins to be a lot of nuance and variation in exactly what color the people were. For example, it was often said that Southern Chinese were darker than Northern Chinese, or Chinese women or Japanese women were whiter than Japanese men, or those who worked in the fields would be darker than those who were government officials and working indoors. So there was begins to be this departure from this initial whiteness, if we can call it that, to describing people of various colors. And one example that I want to give you is I give you his name at the top, which I have typed, a friar, a missionary who comes to China and writes the first great best-selling book about China in 1588 and was translated into numerous languages in numerous editions. And his work was incredibly influential for early ideas of what China was like and what Chinese people were like. And so in his book, he actually does try to describe people's color. And I've highlighted a few examples. This is the English translation, not the original. He tells us that in the city of Canton and in the coast, there are brown people, like in the city of Fez or Barbary. So brown like Northern Africans, he says. This is what he claims to see in Canton. But then the people inwards are white, some more whiter than others as they draw into the cold country. Some are like unto Spaniards and others more yellow, like unto the almonds, Germans, yellow and red color. So there is these variations about climate and about your position and so on. But I think there's also some difficulty really to try to describe what color these people are. I mean, some are brown, some are not, some are like Germans, some are like Spaniards, some are yellow, some are red. And so he throws this out into the community of scholars and readers in the end of the 16th century, and it proliferates into far more color terms as soon as the terms are translated. Because in every European language, the color terms are different, used in different contexts. Another example from in a later chapter, when he returns to this idea of the appearance of the Chinese, he begins to give us a number of cliches that they have little eyes and flat noses and no beards. But when he returns to the question of color, he says they're brown like the Moors once again, but those that are farther within, like the Almains, again, the Germans, Italians and Spaniards, white and red and somewhat swart. Swart or swarthy is yet one more color term. So even in this little text, I mean, how many different terms are there that he uses to describe China or Chinese people? And again, I want to emphasize that the whiteness that they had in the very earliest travelers has moved into something else. And that yellow is one of the many possibilities of what these people could be called. In the original text in Spanish, we see that in fact the terms are quite different. That he says, for example, that they are of different colors, that they're like the Portuguese. And in Canton, he says they are brown like Fez or Berbers, that is close to what the English has said. And he continues again to say that they're like Spanish and Germans. Rubios and Colorados are two Spanish words that both can be translated as red. So the English is more or less faithful to what the original Spanish said. Then, however, in the later chapter, when he returns to the question, he says that the people of Canton are brown in color, amoriscados, or Moorish in color, like Germans, Italians, and Spanish. And they are, sorry, the word is split here. They are blancos, white, rubios, red, and a little bit verde negros, which means dark green. This is a totally shocking, surprising color. So it's just a tiny little example of how complicated it was to describe what color the people of China were. And by 1800, this is a short list in published works of the adjectives that would be used to describe Chinese people. So there's no others. It's not people of the Philippines or people of Korea or people of Japan. It's only people of China, and it's only in published works. And finally, only the terms in English. So we have this situation by 1800 of, I don't know how many, let's say 50 or more, because of the different languages present different problems, all these potential color terms and this wild chaos or wild disagreement. But I want to point out two important things. One, they're no longer white, and two, they are not yellow. So the question is, where does this idea of yellowness come from? In fact, if you try to find the source of it in travel texts, you will not succeed. It is a dead end. And the reason it's a dead end is because the notion of yellow does not come from eyewitness description. No one goes to Asia and sees yellow people. It doesn't happen. And of course, if you think about it, it makes sense because no one is yellow. So where does this idea come from? Where does this notion of yellow, which is so much taken for granted today and is so much a part of yellow peril discourse, where does this come from exactly? The point is that it doesn't come from any kind of eyewitness reportage. Instead, it comes from a totally different direction. It comes from the idea of race. It comes from natural science. It comes from the insistence among early natural scientists of the 18th century and 19th century to map the world, to find a kind of tableau of human species or human peoples, and to divide them according to continent and other characteristics, including color. And it's this desire or need to pigeonhole everyone. First, to lump people together so that all Asia becomes one group, all Europe becomes one group, all America or Africa becomes one group. And then once you have done that, then to assign a color to it. So the idea of yellow and all colors of racial thinking comes after the idea of dividing the world into races. And this is a very important point, and one reason why it's so hard to dismantle it or so hard to dislodge it, because it has nothing to do with physical appearance. It has nothing to do with human nature in any way. It comes from a racialized vision of the world that is itself a myth, and itself what has been rightly called man's most dangerous myth. This is where all color terms, including white and including black, come from. So I want to give you an example of one of the first of these natural scientists who attempts to map out the world and to provide color terms. And his name at the bottom of the screen is Carl Linné, or Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish taxonomer, physician, and botanist in the 18th century. And he, in this very hubristic way, publishes this book with this amazing title, The Systems of Nature. Systema Naturae. He attempts to systematize all of nature. And in 1735, and I have actually copied for you here the whole book because it's only 10 pages long, it's this series of tables in which he has divided the entire natural world into animal, vegetable, mineral, and here you see classes and genera and species. So he was the first to really provide this attempt to systematize everything into genus and species, and his attempt to do this remains with us today. Linnaeus is fundamental in all taxonomy, even to this day. And in these 10 pages, he just gives you these tables. The first one is minerals, the second one is vegetables, and the final one is animals. And that's the last page. This is the whole book in 1735. And it caused a tremendous sensation because it apparently provided this logical and rational vision of the entire natural world. And Linnaeus spent the next decades of his life amplifying and adding to this until finally in the definitive edition in 1758 and 59, it becomes a 2-volume, several thousand-page book in which these initial tables are filled in with more and more divisions and subdivisions, more and more genera and species and so on. But I wanted to point out in this first table, which let me go back to it, which is the the regnum animale. It's very difficult. You see on the left side, the quadrupeds. Man will have the first position, the quadrupeds being considered the highest form of the natural world. And here in the upper left-hand corner, I've given you enlargement of what he says about quadrupeds. Homo, man, is the highest form of the quadrupeds, the highest form of animal world. And he divides Homo into 4 groups: Europaeus, Americanus, Asiaticus, and Africanus. And already it's hard to understand how incredible this is. It was the first time that a major scientific theorist divides the world into 4 continents in this way, as if there are 4 types of man divided by continent, as if you could divide human beings in the same way you divide horses or breeds of dog or flowers, that man can be divided into these continents. And he assigns, incredibly enough, a color to each of them. He says that Europeans are albescens, which means white, Americans are rubescens, red, Asians are fuscus, and Africans are nigrum, or black. Now, the problem here is, what is fuscus, F-U-S-C-U-S? In Latin, it is not a specific color. It means something very vague, like dark. And I would suggest that Linnaeus actually has a problem in his taxonomy to try to choose a single color for Asian man. For Europeans and Africans, white versus black, that's a very old dichotomy in the Western tradition. For him, that's no problem. The idea of red American Indians was a new stereotype, a new cliche in the 18th century that he picks up. But Asians are dark. This is not a color. And I would like to suggest that this is a problem for Linnaeus. And over the next decades, as I mentioned earlier, he continues to amplify this text until finally in the definitive edition in 1758, the 10th edition, he changes it silently to a different color. And you see that there's a lot more information here. We have the Americans, the Europeans with a lot of adjectives, the Asians, and finally the Africans, followed by a section on monsters. These are various kinds of human forms that don't fit into his particular schema. But what he does then is let me go back one more. He decides that he doesn't like the word fuscus any longer, and he changes it to the word luridus for Asian man. Luridus in Latin is close to the English word lurid. Again, it's not a particular color, but it's no longer dark. It's something lurid, which I guess you would say something like ghastly or sallow, or maybe the color of a corpse. And again, Linnaeus gives no information about why he makes this change. Lurid also has a certain valence of danger in Linnaeus' mind. He uses the idea of luridness also in terms of plants, for example. When plants do not have the right minerals, they become lurid looking because they are withering or dying. And so Linnaeus decides that rather than dark Asians, instead they will be sickly Asians. Or again, I think there's an idea of danger that also intervenes here, also becomes part of his taxonomy. So these are mysterious words, but again, not yellow. I also finally give you a translation of the full tableau as he has given it in the 10th edition to show you how he's obsessed with these apparent parallels, that each of the groups must have a matching qualification that can be compared to the others. And this kind of tableau in which the God's organization of the world is being shown. And it's not just that they have different colors, but they also have other qualities. And you have these strange attempts to find differentiation. For example, the Americans paint themselves with red lines. Europeans have tight clothing, Asians have loose clothing, and Africans have no clothing at all. They just anoint themselves. So this attempt to find this unique position for each of these four groups. And again, the Asian man is called sallow, which is a good translation of the word luridus. So by 1750, there's still no such thing as a yellow Asian. If anything, that comes in our next theorist, which I've given at the bottom of the screen, called Blumenbach, a name that is largely forgotten today, but in the 18th and early 19th centuries, Blumenbach was a gigantic influence, and he lived to be a very old man, and his influence in natural science and in taxonomy was immense. And he is best known today for giving us the racial categories, many of which we still use today. He did not invent them, but he popularized them. And of course, the word Caucasian is the most well-known today, and we still use today. It comes from Blumenbach at the end of the 18th century. And he also changes the idea of Asian man to this racial category, Mongolian, which is not used so much anymore, but in science and scientific discourse was the standard term for Asians. So Blumenbach, he attempts to improve upon Linnaeus to give names and racial categories for each of the five groups. By now there are five rather than four, because the Malays are a new group discovered only at during the 18th century. And he, for the first time, uses the word yellow. And when he describes what he calls the second category, which is the Mongolian, he says in Latin they are gilvus or buxeus. Gilvus means yellow in Latin. And in case you didn't get it, he even gives the English terms yellow and olive tinge. So although he makes it more complicated because maybe yellow and olive are not exactly the same, but in a major theorist, this is the first time that you unequivocally have the word yellow attached to the entirety of the Mongolian racial group. If there is an origin of yellowness, it would be in Blumenbach in 1795. But I want to stress once again that it is only when the racial grouping is decided upon, in this case Mongolian, that the color term is applied. The color term does not come first. The color term is not based on physical appearance. The color term is only based on this idea that you can divide the world into races. And I want to point out also that we have to remember that racial thinking is inherently a hierarchy. The purpose of racial thinking is not really to map out the world in these equivalent pigeonholes. The point of racial thinking is to privilege one group over another, always. So the point of racial thinking is to privilege the white Caucasian or white European. That is its real function. It is not really to describe anyone. It is only to distance groups from the supposed pure group or the group that has no color. that is something that we have to remember about the whole idea of racial thinking or racism generally. So just to give you sorry, I forgot I had the English version. The second is yellow tinge, and also this strange comparison that Blumenbach attempts to make about what do I mean by yellow. He says halfway between grains of wheat and cooked oranges, or dry and extricated rind of lemons, very usual in the Mongolian nations. This is again this very bizarre way in which he says, I don't just mean yellow, I mean halfway between wheat and cooked oranges, or sucked out and dried lemon peel. I mean, it's very bizarre attempt to identify exactly what kind of yellow he means. And I don't have time to go into that, but this is an extremely interesting, fascinating quotation that he gives. And then I have another slide, I thought, in which I'm giving you this is about the 5 varieties, including the Mongolians. All right, I don't have another one. So, but basically the point is that it's only in 1795 that you have this notion of a yellow people that is centered on Asia, now called the Mongolian race. And so once you've done that, once you have laid this groundwork or this framework or this attempt to differentiate people, it's only logical that scientists after Blumenbach will attempt to measure and to show exactly in precise ways how the human groups differ. And one of the most famous in the 19th century is Paul Broca, who spent his entire life as many other scientists did, he was not alone, trying to find measuring instruments or way of measuring quantitatively these differences that were supposedly present in human groups. And so in his book, one of his books, he gives us what he calls a chromatic scheme of the eyes. And these are potential different colored eyes that people can have. And he gives it to you in a chart with numbers. So presumably if you are tabulating or investigating human subjects, you can write down the number of the color of their eyes. And for some reason, this was seen to be a useful exercise. And you might argue that with the question of eye color, it's relatively simple because there aren't that many different colors of eyes. But what about the problem of human skin? Broca also attempts to give us a chart of skin colors. And this appeared in the same book. And this is a much stranger and more unusual attempt to try to quantify variations in people's skin. And I don't really even know how you were supposed to use this. Were you supposed to hold up this book to the skin of a person and then write down the number? And then many questions come to mind, like how did you choose these colors and how are they arranged? It's not really explained in Broca's book, except that he says that the colors on the left-hand margin are different colors mixed with black. But you'll notice that the first line starts one space to the right because the first line is evidently no black at all. And so it's clear you see in this very, very obvious way that what's happening is he is separating people who have no black in their skin from all of the rest underneath who do. It's the privileging of the so-called white group who will be this color, as opposed to everyone underneath who will have some bit of blackness in them. So may I ask how much time do I have? I could stop here, I could continue. Can anyone give me a clue about that, please?
Yeah, Professor Keevak, you still have 10 minutes, about 8 to 10.
Okay, no problem. So it's good that I have more time because I'm only giving you here some measurement tools in the newly evolving field of anthropology But the other place that this idea of measurement or the identification of what the Mongolian race is comes from the science of medicine. Before we move on to medicine, this is where an extreme example of the obsession with finding different colors of people. And this is a chart that is supposed to be measuring the peoples who live on one Indonesian island only. And so again, you ask yourself, what is the purpose of this? These tiny little gradations and numbers attached to them. What exactly is this for? What exactly are you measuring and what are you purporting to do with this information? And an amusing example of ways that skin color would be measured. This is a fan with different colors painted on it, and you open out the fan and there are holes in it and numbers and colors so that you hold it up to the skin of a person and write down the color of what their skin is. This was then also done in anthropology in the early 20th century, where a child's spinning top was actually used to measure colors, and you would adjust the colors on this top in order to replicate the skin color of the person you were measuring. So they would put their arm on a table and you would spin a top next to it and adjust the colors until you achieve the color of their skin. And you notice that the colors used to so-called measure their skin are the very four colors presumed to be the colors of man: white, black, yellow, and red. I don't have time to go into this too, but the whole point of this exercise is that it proves nothing, and you've simply loaded the dice with these colors. And so of course you're going to have people who end up being more yellow than others. And surprise, surprise, it happens to be Asian people. It doesn't always work out so cleanly, but the idea is that this obsession with measuring color really gets out of hand, but is in fact based on absolutely nothing. But in the field of medicine, the Mongolian race was also very importantly measured. And one of the ways in which this was done is the so-called Mongolian eye fold, or the epicanthus, which is the bit of skin in the corners of the eyes of Asian people that was supposedly unique to them only. And so you have these texts trying to measure and show how different eyes are shaped and how only Asians have this particular thing in their eye. And so you have these images of different kinds of so-called Mongolian eyes, or, well, the text says the slanting of the eyes in the Japanese. This is only a book about Japan. And at the bottom here, you'll have the so-called normal eye, which doesn't have the epicanthus. So we have the Mongolian eye. This is another example of how you can find these tiny little variations in these different kinds of Mongolian eyes, which don't afflict white people, but only Mongolian people. Then the Mongolian spot, which is a pigment spot that appears on the back of babies and was discovered among Asian babies by European doctors who were working in Asia, especially in Japan. And it was wondered or supposed, do these spots only appear on Asian babies? Is this a marker of Mongolianness, whatever that means? And so they named it the Mongolian spot, as if it was a marker of Asianness or Mongolianness. And in fact, the term Mongolian spot is still used in pediatrics. And finally, Mongolism, today called Down syndrome, was a third way in which this idea of what the Mongol race was furthered by the medical profession. And the idea behind it was that these are English boys who the stereotype or the prejudice of the day was that children with Down syndrome look Asian. They look like Asians. And that this is a kind of deformity and a kind of proof that when you take a white child and because of illness or because of some kind of deformation, he becomes lower in the racial schema, and he begins to look like a Mongolian. So you have these ways in which this notion of Mongolian is measured and described and distanced from so-called white normality. And so there are other examples of how supposedly a girl with Down syndrome looks like a girl from Mongolia. This is an English girl, or how an English boy with Down syndrome looks like an Asian man, and supposedly showing us or proving that somehow English people who are ill can look Mongolian. And finally, in one of the most insane and amusing examples, in which a theorist to show that a young boy with Down syndrome, a Buddhist monk, and an orangutan all instinctively sit in a cross-legged posture, supposedly again showing the realities of Mongolians as a race. They are like the lower orangutan monkeys and like the lower or ill or sickly white child. So I know I'm moving very quickly, but I just want to show this final image, and with this we will stop. This is the image of the yellow peril that becomes canonized in 1895 and was circulated worldwide. This is the canonical image of the 19th century vision of the yellow peril, in which the Archangel Michael is calling the maidens of Europe, these are the countries of Europe, to be afraid of this impending doom from the East, represented by a Buddha with flames behind him. And he is coming to the West over this European valley, and Europe is in danger. And the Christian world, represented by the cross, is in danger of being invaded by these people from Asia. So I want to conclude here by pointing out that now, when you are thinking about peril, it is fully a yellow peril. Previously, it was just a peril, but now through all of this racial and scientific and medical discourse, this notion of yellowness is invested with so much more. And so key takeaways, give me just one more minute. 1, yellow is comparatively recent. 2, yellow is not based on eyewitness description. 3, yellow stems from natural science and the desire to create racial hierarchies. And 4th, which I'm not going into at all, but which many people mistake, yellow is not based on the notion of yellow in Chinese culture. There is absolutely no connection between yellow as a central color in Chinese thinking and yellow as a racial group or yellow as a racial category. So I think I'll stop here just to show that yellow is a very problematic term. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Keevak, for an exciting trip into some of the saddest and most sickening aspects of Western intellectual racism. We have time for questions and answers, and so far we have one question in the Q&A. Let me encourage all participants to type their questions into the Q&A. I'll read them out and relay them to Professor Keevak as best I can. And let me start with the one that is here already from Daniel Devini. The question, could you please talk about how the idea of yellow makes the leap from the anthropology and medicine to popular racial terms, from the scientific imagination to the popular imagination?
Well, it's a very good question, and I don't know if I would consider it a leap, as a matter of fact. I mean, what you're calling the scientific imagination was also the popular imagination in a very certain sense. I mean, the scientific imagination was so powerful and so pervasive that I don't really see it as jumping somehow into the popular imagination. The idea of yellow from these discourses becomes immediately and steadily filtered into every kind of popular discourse as well as scientific discourse. It starts to appear in every kind of publication and in every sort of context. So I don't I don't know that I would call it really a leap. I don't see it as a difficulty in how it reaches from one to the other. It's just from the pervasiveness and the strength and how, and of course, during the period of Western colonialism in the 19th century, it becomes filtered into popular culture seamlessly and very easily, along with many other factors, not just racial ones. So I think that's how I would respond to that question. It's a very good question, though.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Keevak. Another question has just come in. We're going to keep you busy here for the Q&A period. We have a question from Sarah Dolan. I just want to thank you for your research in your book. I read it while I was looking for the origins of slant-eye discourse in order to inform my research on the use of slanted eyes to racialize and racially mark Asians and Asian American bodies in children's books and other media. It was exactly what I needed, and I cite you whenever I address this in my research and presentations. Thank you. That was not so much a question, but something I firmly agree with as far as the value of your scholarship here. We have another question from Ian Wang. Did you say the term yellow originally was used as a scientific term to describe Asian people?
Yes, in a certain sense, that is what I'm saying. In other words, my major point of this whole book or this whole talk is that yellow is not a descriptor of anyone's skin. It doesn't come from anyone meeting Asians and saying, these are people who look yellow to me. That is not the source of yellowness. It comes from a different direction. It comes from an interest in providing racial hierarchies. It comes in an interest in differentiating peoples according to different qualities, including their color. So yes, I would call that scientific rather than something like, I don't know, I call it eyewitness description, but it's not physical characteristics. I mean, I have this problem every time I talk about this in a public context, that I have people who insist that they are yellow and that they will even hold up their arm and say, don't you see there is yellow in my skin? I don't understand. And I'm sorry, I don't see yellow when I look at Asian people. I mean, color perception is a big problem, as well as the question of what color someone's skin really is a totally different problem. But I'm just saying that the idea of yellowness is not based on any physical characteristics that people perceive. It's not neutral. It really comes from a totally different direction, which is the idea of race and the idea of racial differentiation.
Thanks, Michael. Not only do you not see yellow when you look at Asian skin, but no people of European origin for the millennia of contact between Europe and Asia saw yellow or exclusively yellow when they looked at Asian skin. So it's not just you, it's thousands of people over hundreds and hundreds of years. We have another question here from an anonymous attendee. Thank you so much for your presentation. I am curious about the first use of yellow in anthropological studies. 1795 is long after the Pan-Asian Empire of the Mongols was established. Is there another reason why this comes up in 1795?
So 1795 rather than, I don't know, rather than 1495 or 1695. I mean, it comes in a tradition of taxonomy begun by Linnaeus. And Blumenbach is working in this tradition and accumulated knowledge about Asia, but also accumulated understandings about taxonomy and the ways of differentiating people. This is what lies behind Blumenbach's pronouncements. And this is why it's 1795. It's just that it is comparatively late, and it doesn't have anything to do with the real Mongols. In terms of there's no connection between them. No one said about the Mongols in the 13th century that they were yellow. It comes again from a totally different direction, and it comes in developing trends in taxonomy and natural science that will soon become anthropology. Early anthropology is entirely race-based and racialized. And so once anthropology, which is a much more popular field, begins to take hold of it in the early 19th century, then yellow is just ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it's manifested in countless ways. So that's my answer. That's why it's 1795.
Professor Keevak, would you add to that perhaps that 1795 is an important time for putting whiteness on a new scientific, ethnographic, and medical foundation? So 1795 has nothing to do with anything that's happening with people in East Asia, but it is a crucial time for creating whiteness. And if we ignore whiteness or pretend that whiteness doesn't exist, some of these developments are quite mystifying. But if we look at the history of whiteness, then we can see what's going on around 1795.
Yes.
Oh, Dan has a question here. Please go ahead. Unmute.
Actually, I think Rod Wilson has a question before me. So
there's two more. Sorry, there's a few more questions coming up in the chat here. Please go ahead. Rod, thank you for this talk. This is my colleague Rod Wilson in history. Very interesting. My question is, how did the authors of these pseudo-scientific studies discuss miscegenation? And have you noticed any significant changes in that discourse over the 19th and 20th centuries?
Yeah, that is an area that I have not looked at in detail, but yes, there's always that aspect. It's always something that it's not something that I think of so much, but it's the idea of miscegenation, or the idea of racial purity and preserving it, and what happens when races are mixing and so on. That is a major aspect of the discourse that I really don't get into, but I'm happy that you have pointed that out. But that plays itself out in very interesting ways into the 20th century, and the idea of eugenics and so on, and theories about racial cleansing. But it is admittedly something that I do not examine in detail.
We have three questions here that are on similar terms. So I'd like to kind of read you all three of them and bundle them together real quickly. From Hanping Li, the concept of yellow race seems to be far more popular and accepted in China than in Japan. Does this have anything to do with the connotation of yellow as an honorable color in Chinese culture, even though the invention of the concept of yellow people or yellow peril itself has nothing to do with Chinese culture? Anonymous attendee asks, yellow was associated with the emperor in Chinese culture. Could this have been transferred to a general racialized notion of China? And then the third question from Jun Huang, maybe when the Chinese talk about themselves being yellow, it means something cultural and political rather than racial, and calling themselves being yellow was likely a relatively recent political invention, which I think is actually part of the answer to the question that was raised by the first two. So take it away on those three, please.
All fantastic questions. I apologize that the last chapter of my book is something I didn't touch upon in this talk. If you want to invite me back to talk about that chapter, I can, but it has to do with the question of how this idea of yellow is received in Asia. And it's so interesting and so important. I just didn't have time to talk about this today. And you're absolutely right that in Japan, yellow doesn't have any meaning at all. It's only in China. I mean, and this one problem. And the second problem is, how do Chinese receive this idea of yellow? And in many cases, they embrace it. And they say that, yes, we are yellow, and yellow is superior, and yellow is the color of our culture. And we are superior people because we are gold people, and white people are just silver, and they're lower than we are. I mean, there's so many other ways that this knowledge is being received and incorporated into Asia itself. When it becomes popularized in the West, then it also filters back into Asia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it changes, and this is really, I'm so happy that these questions are raised, because the idea of combating racism today and institutionalized racism today, we have to be very careful when we think about yellowness, or even the pride that Chinese culture can take in yellow. We have to be very careful when we use that word, because it comes from a totally different direction, and a very horrible and evil direction in Western thinking about racial categories. You can't just elide that difference. You have to be very attentive to it. Recently, there was a article that appeared, I don't remember where, it was CNN or New York Times or something, where some activists were wondering, should we appropriate the word yellow for ourselves now? Should we call ourselves yellow today? And I was contacted and interviewed what was my opinion of this. And I was actually a little bit horrified by this. I thought, well, this is very dangerous. I understand that you want to appropriate this racial slur and to proudly carry it in the same way that queer people could be called queer and be proud of the fact that it was used to be a slur. But the term is so different. This idea of yellow, it really comes from a different direction, and you just have to be very careful when you put them next to each other. What it means in Asia now and what it meant in the Western racial tradition, I think really have to be separated, and one has to be very cautious. I'm so happy that these questions are being asked, but I'm sorry, you'll have to ask me back and I'll give another talk about that.
Yeah, we we'll try to invite you back. My question is related to Rod's question as well as Han Ping and Zhong Huang's question. You know, I don't know how many of you watched the Crazy Rich Asians movie, and they use music of Coldplay's song Yellow. Right, and the director wrote a very lovely, touching letter to Chris Martin, saying the word yellow has always had a negative connotation in my life as an Chinese Asian American in America. Right. So until I heard your song, and we noticed, in fact, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in mainland China since the 1980s, some popular songs they just have the lyrics on yellow skin, black hair, black eyes as the physical features we should be proud of, right? So related to all these previous questions, I'm wondering whether using this term is a problem for we East Asians ourselves. You know, so many young people from the early 80s to now, they sing those popular songs like 黑眼睛黑头发黄皮肤 or the yellow skin. Nothing you feel ashamed of. So I would like to listen to Professor Keevak's opinion. Maybe no time, but maybe another lecture on your last chapter.
I think it would have to be another lecture. I'm just very hesitant. I mean, I understand the tendency, but it disturbs me. I mean, I actually feel that yellow should be banned as a word. I never want it to be used, or you know, at very least in quotation marks, but that doesn't really say anything about, you know, among Asians. But really, it's only Chinese as opposed to the Japanese, for example. It's a very important distinction. It doesn't have any such meaning in Japanese culture. It's really only in Chinese. Yeah, these questions, they're too big, they're too difficult, but I'm just hesitant whenever I hear the word used in Asian languages as well.
I fully understand.
It makes me very nervous.
I understand. There are two more questions in the queue, and I'll try to give voice to those very quickly. The next question in the queue thanks you for the insightful presentation. And the question is, aside from the anthropological aspects, do philosophers of the 18th century, such as Hume and Kant's views and ethical theories on skin color, largely contribute to the division of skin colors? That's the way I understand that.
Yes,
Go
certainly.
ahead.
Kant is a figure who has a lot to say about colors, and of Hume as well. And there are various other people who contribute to the discussion. But Kant is a difficult case because he uses the word yellow, but not really to describe Asians. He uses the word yellow to describe people in India, and then there's various slippages about what he means by Asia, because of course Asia is a very big category. Asia is the Middle East, Asia is India, Asia is Southeast Asia, I mean, and Japan. I mean, they're all lumped together in one. So there are lots of different voices and people who also contribute but I'm focusing on the taxonomers because they are the ones who really lump together in a scientific way, or attempt to lump together, all of the people into this Mongolian group. So what they have done is much more powerful and much more, has a much greater effect than the individual voices of philosophers like Kant and Hume. And there were others, many others in the 18th and 19th centuries who voiced their opinions about what color any particular group was. It's a very good question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have a follow-up question from Ian Wang, and he's asking, so nowadays the use of the term yellow has nothing to do or no link to the historical origin of the scientific use of yellow to describe the skin color of people.
No, I don't think it's true that it has nothing to do. I'm just saying that there's a separation that needs to be maintained. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of, because the idea of yellow is being received and understood in a certain way by modern Asian people who may consider themselves to be yellow or proudly yellow. But and so it's not that it has nothing to do. It's precisely the opposite. There's an imbrication and there's a lot of overlap that needs to be thought about when we think about yellow, especially as a positive term for among Asian people today.
And is there another question in the queue or in the chat?
In the chat, yes, Craig.
Okay. Yeah. So Michelle Zhang is asking, how about the concept of white or black people, referring back to the discussion about whether the term yellow should be accepted or rejected or neither as a description. Do you think we should also avoid using these?
Absolutely. I think we shouldn't be using the word white or black either. I personally, avoid those. I mean, I will say things like so-called white or so-called black. The problem of blackness has another political ramification today. There was a time in the United States where you weren't supposed to use it, but now it's returned. Again, it's totally different from yellowness in many ways, although there is a parallel. Personally, I would like to avoid all color terms. But the idea of white versus black in the Western tradition is very, very old and very, very ancient. It really goes back to the origins of Western thinking. In the Bible, in the Old and New Testaments, white and black is very repeatedly emphasized. Whiteness versus blackness, and black is the color of Satan, and white is the color of cleanliness and godliness, and so on. So there is this dichotomy already in place long before any European even met Africans. There's already this dichotomy in place, so that there is this opposite, white versus black. But my question is, what about these so-called in-between peoples like Asians? I mean, they're not black, they're not white, but then what are they? And this is indeed an issue and a problem, and we see many, many thinkers struggling with exactly what to call them. But personally, no, I think we shouldn't use the word black or white either. I mean, these are often terms of convenience. And when we refer to the Black community today, we're encouraged to use the word black, and there's a lot of politics involved and so on, a history of that. But I think the word white I find particularly odious, and I try as much as possible not to use that word. But again, it's so ingrained in our thinking that it's sometimes hard to find substitutes. So I think you could say so-called white or white in quotation marks, and maybe that would be good enough for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think topics for graduate student research have certainly surfaced and been exchanged here. Future work for all of us to do, not just you. But as it's almost 10 minutes past the hour now, and it's a late hour for you, I think we might want to thank you again. And I'll hand it back to Dan to wrap up this first discussion in the Yellow Peril Redux series. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Keevak, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And just remember, on April 28th, we will have another talk by Justice Sabrina McKenna on the yellow peril and the law. Looking forward to meeting you online that time. And again, Professor Keevak, I will try to invite you back. Okay.
Sure. Anytime. I'm
Bye.
happy.
Yeah. Have a good evening there and
Thank
a
you.
good day here, everyone.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.